Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The day the Library of Lima went missing. In a city known for its misty mornings and colonial stonework, Lima, Ohio, boasted one of the most intricately cataloged small libraries in the Midwest. The Lima City Library wasn't just a repository of books, it was a town vault of local memory. Among its collection were rare maps, first editions from the 19th century, war journals from veterans of World War I, and a climate-controlled annex housing early city planning records dating back to 1822. On March 5, 2008, the library opened like it always did 8:00 a.m. sharp. Patrons wandered in for their usual rituals, the crossword crowd near the microfiche machines, high schoolers seeking silent study corners, and retirees inspecting new arrivals. But by 4:13 p.m., library assistant Callie Werner noticed something off. A set of shelves near the back, previously filled with local archives, stood empty. At first, staff assumed it was a reorganization, but the real horror unfolded over the next 48 hours. Over 4,000 items, books, documents, ledgers, photographs, audio reels had vanished, not misfiled, not in processing, gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks. The cameras, still operational but hard drives showed gaps in data. Almost 6 hours of footage was missing, neatly extracted from the middle of the day without triggering a single IT flag. The annex's temperature logs were blank. Fire suppression sensors logged no movement, no dust displacement. And yet, entire steel filing drawers, some weighing close to 60 pounds, were removed from locked cabinets. A quiet crime with loud implications. Lima's library theft didn't draw national headlines. There were no high-speed chases or missing millions. But for a town whose history had literally been taken off the shelves, it was nothing short of cultural erasure. Some of the stolen items were believed to be unique, never digitized, never cataloged anywhere else. The case was first investigated by the local police department, but after a month of dead ends, it was quietly handed over to the state's Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI. The lead investigator, Special Agent Donna Harkley, later described it as a robbery that smelled more like a deep file system error than a burglary. But what fascinated investigators was what wasn't taken. Rare books with market value, left behind, valuable first editions, still in place. Even local Civil War diaries displayed in sealed glass cases remained untouched. Instead, the stolen materials pointed to something deeper: land ownership deeds, mining records, and old tax assessments from the 1870s to 1920s. Every item seemed to share a link to territory, property, or municipal law. The forgotten annex. Many of the items had been stored in the lesser-known Annex C, a room not even included in the main building's tour or floor plan. Originally used for civil defense drills in the 1950s, it had been converted into document storage sometime in the late 1970s. It required 2 keys to open, one held by the library director, and the other held by a retired city records officer, Ernie Metzger, age 78. Ernie was polite but cryptic when interviewed. "Nobody's used that room in 20 years, he claimed. Not since they found out about the leak in the foundation. Yet the temperature logs showed it had been stable, no flooding, no significant drops in humidity. When pressed, Ernie said something strange. "I don't suppose you folks believe in second deeds." When investigators looked into that phrase, they uncovered an obscure practice once common in small Ohio counties. Shadow deeds, unregistered property transfers kept in municipal storage for legal disputes, often hidden until land values spiked. Shadow deeds and motivated ghosts. That turned the case upside down. The missing documents weren't valuable in a traditional sense, they were valuable for what they could prove or disprove. Some of the stolen files referenced properties that decades later, had become gas station chains, commercial malls, and even highways. If one were to resurface, a deed indicating a different historical ownership, legal chaos would ensue. The theory began to take shape. This wasn't a heist for resale. It was a crime of silence. Someone was erasing paper trails. Someone with enough knowledge to know exactly where the ghosts of old claims lived and how to remove them without disturbing the bones. But who would benefit from the mass disappearance of obscure property documents? The town had no booming economy, no major developers, no public land disputes, at least none on record. And yet, just 3 weeks before the theft, the town council had quietly approved a rezoning request along the southern ridge land previously considered unsuitable for development due to unverified historical ownership. Coincidence? Special Agent Harkley wasn't convinced. A cold lead and a broken copier. Then came the copier repair ticket. Buried in the work orders submitted by the library was a request dated February 22nd, nearly 2 weeks before the theft. It described a jammed document feeder on the industrial copier near the staff office. The tech left a note: strange mineral powder observed inside machine, likely gypsum dust, unusual for this model. Gypsum dust was commonly found in aged paper, especially uncoated 19th century ledger stock. But it also flaked off of freshly refiled archival material, or material that had been extensively handled or copied. Forensic sweep of the copier room revealed a faint chemical compound used in high-speed scanning machines, not standard library equipment. One library employee, when asked about unusual noises or tech, recalled hearing a whirring sound from the copier room overnight the week before the items vanished. Were the materials stolen or scanned? And if scanned, who had access to such technology, and why go through the trouble? Surveillance loopholes. Finally, there was the matter of the footage. Lima Library's camera system wasn't wireless, but it did upload to a cloud-based repository. The data gap wasn't caused by deletion, it was caused by redirection. The stream was rerouted for exactly 6 hours to a separate internal IP, likely an offline local server. This redirection required admin access, something only 2 people had: the library's IT manager and an external contractor hired 6 months prior for a records modernization project. That contractor, Jonah S., had since moved to Michigan. Repeated contact attempts failed. His LLC, originally registered to a P.O. box, was dissolved just weeks after the incident. But what bothered Agent Harkley most was the timing. Everything pointed to preparation, a careful study of records, technology, procedures. Nothing rushed. No vandalism, just removal, quiet, surgical, thorough. It was as if the crime had been rehearsed. But if this was a surgical strike, who was the patient and what was the disease they were cutting out? The silence that settled over Lima's library was heavier than usual, not just from the missing materials, but from the quiet refusal of answers. Theories were whispered among city council members and old-timers at the diner counter. Was it a cover-up, a property grab, or just a tech-savvy thief with an unusual taste in dusty records? But one thread began to stretch longer than the others: the external contractor, Jonah S. Jonah had arrived in Lima through a contract awarded via the County Modernization Grant Fund. He was billed as a records digitization specialist, with a modest portfolio of small-town municipal work in Indiana and West Virginia. His proposal to Lima was simple: help the city and library convert their analog records into searchable digital databases. A $24,000 project. Reasonable, efficient, and quietly approved. His work was unassuming. He brought in his own equipment: 2 scanning units, a small desktop tower, and a climate-controlled storage box. Library staff said he often worked late, politely declining coffee or small talk. Then, without formal closure or a final report, he was gone. An LLC and a land deal. The search for Jonah took Special Agent Harkley into murky waters. The address on his invoices led to a residential mailbox in Findlay, Ohio, about an hour's drive north. The neighbors hadn't seen anyone come or go in months. His business, Portlight Solutions, was a single-member LLC registered with minimal detail. What was curious, though, was its sudden dissolution. Jonah had filed to terminate the LLC just 5 days after the library heist. Another layer emerged when Harkley requested public land transaction records for Allen County. A property transfer appeared dated April 18, 2008, involving a strip of undeveloped woodland that had long been in ownership dispute land directly affected by the missing shadow deeds. The buyer, a newly incorporated company named Bright Arbor Holdings, and their listed agent of service, Jonah S. again. The implication was staggering. The stolen documents may not have been destroyed or even hidden but used. A trail of dust and data. In the weeks that followed, investigators were able to confirm that Jonah had not simply scanned public records for redundancy. Instead, he had created unauthorized digital duplicates of proprietary land documents, some dating back to before Ohio's modern record-keeping laws were in place. What did that mean in practical terms? It meant that with the right documents, especially those long assumed lost or never digitized, Jonah could fabricate plausible ownership claims, complete with time-stamped digital metadata, mimicking the authenticity of real deeds. To an underfunded zoning board or an overworked legal assistant, these records might pass as legitimate. But this wasn't just about selling land. It was about changing the legal memory of a place. A man with no mugshot. As Agent Harkley attempted to track Jonah through conventional methods, she ran into a bizarre obstacle. He had no criminal record, no traffic violations, no medical bills in collections, no utility accounts in his name. Not even a high school yearbook photo. The only photographs that existed of Jonah were in library staff ID logs, and even those were grainy. A man who billed himself as a contractor, lived in town for nearly 6 months, interacted with city officials, and yet left behind less of a trace than a library card. Eventually, the Bureau requested a financial investigation. Jonah had set up 5 separate bank accounts under 3 business aliases, all dissolved within 90 days of each other. The routing numbers revealed transfers from obscure real estate law firms, some of which were later found to be connected to civil asset dispute cases in Pennsylvania and Kentucky. He was selling access to proof, not the land itself. Land rights, mineral rights, rights of way, hidden easements, historical claims, all things that could become extremely valuable if a certain company wanted to build on land assumed to be uncontested. Jonah wasn't a thief. He was a black market document broker. The developer who vanished. 6 months later, in a separate investigation unrelated to the Lima case, an oil and gas development firm, Helix Point Industries, filed for bankruptcy. Buried in the disclosures was an acquisition made through Bright Arbor Holdings, a parcel of Ohio land described as historically disputed, with development blocked due to zoning conflicts. But here's the odd part. The same land had been purchased 3 separate times in 3 different counties by 3 separate shell corporations, all tied to digital documentation that, when examined, led back to Lima's stolen records. In essence, Jonah had sold the same document-fabricated claims to multiple buyers, each believing they had legitimate stakes in the land. The fallout: multiple lawsuits, disrupted projects, millions in losses. But still, no trace of Jonah himself. The digital drop. Eventually, the Bureau found a break. An encrypted archive, one of many uploaded to a defunct private server, was cracked using a password hint embedded in the file's metadata. It revealed partial scans of the Lima library's missing documents, sorted meticulously into folders by year, region, and property class. The files had been renamed, watermarked with fake city seals, but they were, undeniably, real documents copied and altered with forensic-level precision. Harkley believed Jonah may have sold dozens, even hundreds of these files to parties looking for quiet legal leverage. Investors, developers, litigants, anyone who might benefit from evidence that just so happened to emerge from the forgotten corners of American bureaucracy. Jonah had effectively created a gray market memory bank, one where history could be edited, deleted, or purchased. The unasked question. Throughout this, something haunted Harkley, not what Jonah took, but what he didn't. Thousands of files were untouched tax records, public ledgers, school archives, all easy to resell, all left behind. It suggested Jonah wasn't just stealing information, he was curating it, selecting specific kinds of documents, possibly for a client, possibly for a broader plan. The fact that none of the items were destroyed, but instead scanned and strategically leveraged, made her wonder. Was Lima just a trial run? The scope of Jonah's crime had changed. It wasn't just theft. It was memory manipulation as a business model. The Library of Lima didn't just lose papers, it lost proof, and that made it vulnerable in ways it had never imagined. By the time investigators realized what had really been taken, the damage was already deeply embedded in a dozen other systems. Courthouses, zoning boards, title offices. Jonah hadn't just vacuumed history out of a basement, he had introduced doubt into the legal scaffolding of the town. And Lima was only the beginning. The algorithm of erasure. The forensic team at Ohio's Bureau of Criminal Investigation continued to analyze the partial data dumps uncovered from Jonah's abandoned servers. By cross-referencing scanned document structure and naming conventions, they determined that the files hadn't been handled manually. Jonah had written scripts. Using OCR, optical character recognition, and file name fingerprinting, he had automated the cataloging of physical records into digital clones, then layered metadata templates over them to simulate authenticity. The software was elegant. It bypassed visual red flags while embedding forensic signatures designed to fool most digital audit tools. More disturbing was the presence of a tool labeled LedgerGhost, a lightweight Python-based engine designed to cross-reference document wording with local GIS, Geographic Information System, maps, and generate updated versions with adjusted boundary lines. It could forge a credible land deed, with language mirroring legal patterns from the 1800s in under 45 seconds. And that meant Jonah wasn't just a contractor. He was an architect of artificial legal history. The man from nowhere. Interpol was contacted in mid-2009 after a near-identical case was flagged in Manitoba, Canada, where a local historical society discovered that an entire subarchive of Métis land records had been scanned and tampered with. The person of interest, a contractor hired under the name John Seltzer, who bore a striking resemblance to Jonah S., though no passport or immigration record of that alias existed. From this, investigators speculated that Jonah's operation had a model: target underfunded or disorganized record repositories, offer low-cost digitization, and extract legal ammunition in the form of history. The Lima heist may have been the largest, but it certainly wasn't the only one. Yet despite issuing domestic and international alerts, Jonah remained elusive. No known address, no digital signature. Even his supposed college credentials listed as a graduate of an online historical informatics program led nowhere. The university never existed. Jonah S., if that was even his name, had burned every breadcrumb. The attempted reconstruction. Meanwhile, Lima's library staff worked desperately to restore the erased part of their collection, but it became a haunting exercise. There were no backup microfilms for many of the stolen pieces, no digitized redundancy. Some records had only ever existed in one copy and they were gone. Worse still, when the library tried to crowdsource recollections from the community, inconsistencies emerged. People remembered different dates, conflicting versions of ownership, photos that couldn't be located. The town's memory had become fragmented, corrupted by the sheer absence of consensus. In meetings, officials argued over what should be accepted as true. If a record no longer existed, but someone remembered it, was that enough? If a scanned copy turned up online but lacked a chain of custody, could it be trusted? One city council member said it plainly. "We lost the right to say for sure what happened here." And that, more than anything, was the real theft. Legal fallout. Over the next 5 years, Lima and surrounding counties experienced a quiet storm of property lawsuits. Small at first boundary disputes between neighbors, a contested easement near a church parking lot. But soon, larger issues emerged. A logistics company sued the county over right-of-way access across what they claimed was formerly undeclared municipal land. Their case included document scans bearing Lima Library watermarks, but the originals were gone. The courts ruled the files inadmissible, citing questions over their authenticity. A new wave of title insurers began requiring indemnity riders on properties with historical records tied to Lima. Prices rose, land development slowed, and residents found themselves caught in expensive legal limbo over lots they'd lived on for generations. The absence of a single basement annex had become a civic virus, infecting the legitimacy of everything that relied on it. And that's when the FBI stepped in. Federal interest. A joint task force was quietly formed in 2011 under the Department of Justice's Cybercrime and Document Integrity Initiative. The case, internally known as Project Cardstack, had identified at least 11 municipalities with missing or tampered historical records between 2006 and 2010. Each involved a contractor matching Jonah's vague profile. The Bureau classified the operation as a new kind of white-collar espionage, less about financial theft and more about destabilizing transactional truth. Speculation emerged that Jonah wasn't a lone actor. Was he working for legal firms looking for settlement leverage, corporations seeking to untangle land protections, or worse, testing a model for digital legal warfare? There was no conclusive answer. But the documents he left behind, especially those that had been modified, not merely copied, suggested deliberate intent to edit reality, not just observe it. And in Lima, that reality could no longer be fully recovered. The library today. The Lima Library remains open. Its staff has turned part of the missing annex space into a modest exhibit on the incident. Framed blank shelves, old filing cabinets with rusted locks, a plaque that reads, "A memory misplaced is not always a memory lost." The exhibit avoids Jonah's name. Instead, it tells the story of the town's attempt to remember itself in the absence of its own written word. Volunteers continue to digitize remaining collections. Local schools now teach classes on civic memory, archiving, and the importance of backup protocols. A new server cluster was installed with both physical and cloud redundancy. But the town is different now. Skeptical, alert, hesitant. Because if a man could walk into your library, scan your past, and vanish, what else might already be gone without you knowing? A final reflection. In many ways, the Lima Library heist wasn't about land or paper or even fraud. It was about who gets to decide what's real. By quietly removing a set of records, Jonah had shifted the burden of truth onto the memory of people, not paper. And memories are fragile, imperfect, corruptible. He introduced an uncertainty that no trial or recovery plan could undo. And in a world increasingly reliant on digital representations of truth, Lima became a ghost story for bureaucrats, a warning whispered in the server rooms of city halls and libraries across the country. What if the next theft isn't from your vault, but from your version of history? Story 2. The Post Office Ledger That Sank a Town. Nestled in the pine-smothered hills of eastern Kentucky was a town called Woolridge. A coal town turned ghost of itself, Woolridge once bustled with miners and families, the occasional Sunday picnic on its single grassy commons, and a post office that doubled as a gossip depot and town hall. By 2013, however, it was barely more than a bend in the road, population 268, one gas station, and a barber shop that hadn't cut hair since the Clinton administration. But its post office, a squat red brick building with peeling signage and a flagpole that groaned in the wind, still operated. Then came the audit. The U.S. Postal Service performs routine compliance checks on rural branches, but the one that landed in Woolridge wasn't routine. It was prompted by a whistleblower tip, an anonymous complaint that referenced the term postal laundering, a phrase even the auditors hadn't seen before. What they uncovered would not only shutter the Woolridge branch permanently, but would also lead to the discovery of a $9.4 million fraud scheme operating for over a decade right under the noses of the very people who relied on that little building to send birthday cards, apply for passports, and receive pension checks. And it all came down to a ledger book that didn't match. The ledger in question. Each post office branch, especially in smaller towns, keeps a physical ledger known as PS Form 1412. It tracks daily financial activity, money orders sold, stamps issued, cash collected, and so on. In Woolridge, the ledger was still handwritten, something of a local point of pride. When regional auditor Julia Kenslow arrived, she expected to find a sleepy branch with a tidy cash drawer and minimal activity. Instead, she found monthly stamp sales exceeding $85,000, a staggering amount for a town with fewer than 300 people, and no nearby commercial mail clients. Even odder, there was almost no outgoing mail, barely any volume in terms of packages or letters. Most days had one or two outgoing pieces logged, yet the sales continued page after page, signed off with the initials RD. That's where things began to unravel. RD and the Circle of Trust. RD was Rufus Delaney, the Woolridge postmaster for 19 years. A quiet man in his 60s, he had earned the trust of nearly every resident. He knew birthdays, read obituaries aloud to the elderly, and kept peppermints in a jar next to the registry book. Rufus claimed the high stamp numbers were due to collectors' clients from out of town who placed bulk orders for rare or discontinued series. When pressed, he produced receipts, neatly stacked, all signed. But the phone numbers and addresses on those forms led nowhere. Many were post office boxes in other states. Some belonged to people who had died years earlier. What's more, many of the money orders used to purchase these stamp packets were traced back to the Woolridge branch itself. That meant someone was purchasing money orders, converting them into stamp purchases, and possibly redeeming or selling those stamps, reintroducing the value into circulation with minimal tracking. A closed loop, a laundering cycle. And that's when the phrase from the tip started to make sense. Postal Laundering 101. Here how it worked. Money orders were purchased at the Woolridge Post Office using cash, often in small denominations under $1,000, to avoid reporting thresholds. Those money orders were then used to purchase high-value, collectible stamps, most of which were requested from the central USPS warehouse. The stamps were either resold to private buyers or returned as unused inventory to other branches, where they were refunded or exchanged for clean cash or new money orders. The ledgers were manually falsified to keep the appearance of normal operations, with false collector logs and occasional destruction of outgoing logs to erase evidence of the returned stamp stock. The scheme relied on two things: low visibility and high trust. In a town like Woolwich, both were in abundance. The suspicious refunds. The breakthrough came when auditors reviewed stamp refund logs at neighboring post offices. They noticed a pattern. Stamps purchased under a Woolwich ledger account were being returned to other towns across Kentucky, Tennessee, and even as far as Colorado. The volume was significant. In total, over $2.6 million in stamp refunds had been issued over an 8-year period, all pointing back to Woolwich as the origin point. But Rufus wasn't working alone. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a network of cooperating postal employees, mostly part-time workers or contractors, who helped circulate, redeem, or receive the redirected stamp shipments. The operation, while small in number, was vast in reach. At its core was a remarkably simple philosophy. Stamps are money that the government doesn't track like money. And that loophole had been exploited quietly, consistently, invisibly for years. The collapse. Rufus Delaney was arrested on October 22, 2013. The town didn't believe it at first. His house, modest and aging, showed no signs of wealth. His bank accounts were shallow. No luxury cars, no secret properties. But then the investigation uncovered safety deposit boxes, 6 of them, spread across 3 states. Inside, not cash but stamps, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth, sheets upon sheets of commemoratives, defunct series, and high-value priority mail issues. Rufus had turned the USPS into his own personal mint, distributing postage like currency, storing wealth in a form most people never think to audit. Even more disturbing was a set of ledgers found in a false bottom drawer in the post office's desk. These were not official. They were personal. They recorded who had helped, how they were paid, and which branches could be trusted for friendly returns. The web was suddenly wider. It implicated at least 9 other post offices, most in similarly small, economically stressed towns, where a little extra cash might go unquestioned. It wasn't a syndicate. It was something stranger, a distributed agreement of silence, born out of desperation and sustained by paper that nobody ever thought to weigh against the truth. What the town lost. The Woolwich branch was shuttered by January 2014. The building now sits abandoned, with vines creeping up the side and a broken window covered in plywood. The mail is routed through a neighboring county. But the town lost more than a mailing address. It lost its innocence. The residents didn't just lose faith in Rufus. They lost trust in each other. Who else had known? Who else had helped? People began asking questions at the diner, at church, in parking lots. Suspicion grew like mildew. And with the loss of the post office came practical challenges. Elderly residents struggled to access their benefits. Small home businesses had to drive an hour to ship. The absence of that red brick building created a vacuum in both logistics and identity. The ledger that started it all, the one that didn't match, is now sealed in evidence, its pages warped from humidity. A reminder that even the most mundane institution can hide a fortune in plain sight. When the audit in Woolwich first flagged the ledger discrepancies, the term postal laundering sounded more like folklore than federal concern. But as investigators spread across state lines, it became clear that Rufus Delaney had not stumbled into a clever hobby. He had engineered a decentralized fraud network that exploited the very thing America rarely questions: the postal system. The inner circle and the return game. Following Rufus' arrest, forensic accountants pored over years of postal transactions, uncovering an internal network built on quiet cooperation. This wasn't organized crime in the traditional sense. No nicknames, no violence, no threats. Instead, it was what one investigator described as a fraud ring of clerks, not criminals, cooperative, not conspiratorial. At the center of this operation were return hubs, specific post offices in struggling towns that agreed to participate in stamp redemption fraud. A pattern emerged. Woolridge would receive massive stamp shipments, marked as pre-sold to fictional collectors. Those stamps would then be returned by cooperative branches in places like Charleston, West Virginia, and Hazard, Kentucky. Upon return, those offices would issue full refunds, marked as legitimate transaction reversals. Woolridge's ledgers were manually falsified to mirror the phantom transactions. The clerks handling these returns, most of them part-time, nearing retirement, or dependent on the job, were paid quietly. Not in large sums, but small money orders, often under $500, mailed to P.O. boxes or handed off during scheduled clerk exchanges at regional meetings. The stamp as currency. At the heart of the scheme was a realization few had considered. Stamps, like currency, store value. But unlike currency, they're less scrutinized, less regulated, and easier to move. When the USPS releases commemorative or high-value stamps, they are tracked in terms of inventory but not like cash. Once a stamp is sold, it is assumed used unless returned. No national register tracks whether a specific sheet is stuck to a birthday card or sitting in a vault. This created a loophole. Delaney's crew wasn't printing counterfeit money. They were using government-issued value, cycling it through legal refund policies, and turning unused stamps into untraceable profit. Between 2004 and 2013, investigators estimate the ring moved over $9.4 million in stamps, with over $3.1 million successfully converted back into cash through coordinated returns. The rest, likely sold to third-party stamp resellers at discounted rates or held as long-term liquid value in safety deposit boxes. The reseller mystery. A key question remained: who was buying the stamps? One trail led to an online marketplace where collectible stamps were being sold under anonymous usernames. The sellers claimed to be estate managers or downsizing consultants. But IP tracing led to a small shipping and receiving storefront in Lexington, Kentucky, registered under an assumed name. Surveillance caught an elderly woman dropping off packages twice a week, always on Thursdays. Her car was traced to Marie Clay, a retired USPS employee who had briefly worked in Woolridge during the early 2000s. Marie claimed she was simply helping a friend clear out old stock. But when presented with bank records showing over $420,000 in deposits tied to stamp resale proceeds, she stopped speaking altogether. She would later agree to a plea deal, cooperating in exchange for leniency. Her testimony revealed a key part of the scheme. Stamps were mailed in bulk to trusted ex-employees. These employees acted as middlemen, reselling to collectors, estate buyers, or even directly to small businesses that still used traditional postage. The money was then split using mailed money orders, cash handoffs, or discrete bank transfers masked as consulting fees. But perhaps the most astonishing detail: none of the stamps were ever fake. Every single item in circulation was authentic, legally printed, and federally issued. It was the path those stamps took and the lies surrounding their transactions that made it criminal. Why nobody noticed? For nearly a decade, the Woolridge fraud ring operated without triggering a single audit red flag. How? A combination of factors. Low-profile behavior. The ring never funneled more than $90,000 per quarter through any single post office. They rotated returns, spaced out shipments, and never repeated patterns within the same fiscal year. Manual ledgers. Woolridge's insistence on handwritten record-keeping gave them plausible deniability. Scans were blurry, signatures inconsistent. There was always a human error excuse. Postal bureaucracy. The USPS, like many sprawling institutions, had gaps between accounting systems, inventory reporting, and field auditing. Those gaps became the shadows where the ring operated. One audit manager would later say, "They didn't hack the system. They played by its rules better than we did." Community fallout. When the investigation went public in early 2014, Woolridge fractured. Local newspapers from nearby counties ran headlines. Postal kingpin busted in tiny town. $1 million mail fraud leaves Woolridge ashamed. Stamp scheme sparks rural investigations. But for Woolridge residents, the betrayal wasn't financial, it was personal. Rufus Delaney had been at the heart of their town. He delivered groceries during floods, fixed front steps for seniors, gave rides to doctors' appointments. That same man had also logged fake transactions and sent government property out the back door in padded mailers. His trial, held in Lexington, lasted 5 days. He pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and misuse of federal assets. But in a twist few expected, he received only 6 years in prison, thanks to his cooperation and full confession. He claimed he had started the scheme to fund the retirement of a few postal employees who were about to be laid off. What began as a harmless refund loop snowballed into a decade-long black market, impossible to stop without exposing the very people he was trying to help. "We didn't steal from the government," he said in court. "We borrowed from its blind spots." A stamp's afterlife. The remaining stamp inventory seized from Marie Clay, the safety deposit boxes, and several complicit branches was valued at over $2 million. Yet most of it couldn't be used. The USPS, wary of counterfeit associations and legal complications, ordered the stamps destroyed. Boxes of perfectly valid postage were pulped under supervision. One former agent watching the destruction process reportedly muttered, "All that money, and it never left the envelope." The stamp fraud that began in a forgotten Kentucky post office ended in a federal warehouse outside of Cincinnati, where the final boxes containing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of government-issued postage were locked away. The room smelled faintly of paper and printer ink. It might have been mistaken for the backroom of any outdated office supply store. But these boxes were evidence, proof not just of a crime, but of how value, trust, and overlooked systems can quietly mutate under pressure. The quiet aftermath. After the conviction of Rufus Delaney and the quiet, plea bargain disappearances of his small web of collaborators, the story of Woolridge began to fade from the news cycle. The USPS implemented a review of its manual ledger systems. More rural branches were required to switch to fully digital record-keeping. Refunds for stamps over $100 now triggered regional oversight. Clerks received mandatory fraud prevention training. But those changes came years too late for towns like Woolridge. With the post office shuttered and its reputation publicly scorched, Woolridge saw the final flicker of its civic pride extinguished. The building sat dormant, its paint faded to a dusty brick pink. Some in the town wanted it turned into a community center, others wanted it leveled. Eventually, it was sold to a private contractor who turned it into storage for road maintenance equipment. The flagpole was cut down. No plaque was ever installed. No apology ever issued to the people whose town was quietly drained of legitimacy, one money order at a time. The lost money trail. One of the enduring mysteries investigators never fully unraveled was where all the money went. Yes, some of it could be accounted for in safety deposit boxes and discreet bank accounts, but much of it, estimated at over $4 million, was never recovered. Some speculate it was spent quietly in cash. Others believe it was laundered further through small land purchases, gift card conversions, or pawn shops using long-term storage agreements. But more than one investigator proposed a more unsettling theory. Maybe it wasn't about profit in the traditional sense. Rufus's actions and those of his small circle didn't follow the usual motives of greed. There were no lavish vacations, no secret condos, no designer suits or gambling debts. Instead, there were quiet gifts: a town kid whose braces were mysteriously paid for, a widow who found her late husband's funeral bill covered, a church roof fixed with no invoice. This behavior led some to reframe the entire scheme. It wasn't just theft. It was a system of backdoor reparation, a shadow economy run by people who believed the formal one had abandoned their community. It was illegal, it was deceitful, but in the words of one Woolridge resident, "We didn't see a crime, we saw a man trying to keep us stitched together." The culture of paper. What the Woolridge case revealed was not just a local scandal, but a structural vulnerability in how institutions think about trust and verification. Stamps are among the most overlooked value instruments in the United States. They're treated more like office supplies than currency. But in economic terms, they are currency, prepaid units of service backed by a federal guarantee. And unlike cash, stamps don't expire. They don't trigger large transaction alerts. They can be stored indefinitely, moved across borders, and exchanged for cash through refunds or gray market sales. In short, they are value without friction. The USPS had long operated on a model of trust layered on tradition. Small towns managed themselves. Clerks vouched for their own numbers. Audits were rare, and that was once enough. But the Woolridge case pulled back the curtain on a quiet realization. In the absence of oversight, tradition becomes vulnerability. Rufus speaks again. 2 years into his sentence at a low-security prison in Illinois, Rufus Delaney gave a single interview to a small podcast on rural corruption. In it, his voice was steady, unsentimental. "I didn't wake up one day and decide to steal. I woke up one day and realized the systems we were told to protect didn't care if our towns faded away. I found a way to stop the bleeding, or slow it down at least." He acknowledged the wrongness of what he'd done but framed it as an act of preservation, not greed. What people forget is, we didn't take stamps. We took their assumption that nobody would ever count them. When asked if he regretted it, he paused. "I regret that I had to. I regret that it worked." Rufus was released on parole in 2020. He returned to a nearby town under a new name, quietly. Woolridge had no welcome waiting for him, but neither did they protest. Lessons never sent. The Woolridge stamp laundering case is now taught quietly at postal training seminars and financial crimes workshops, not as a flashy fraud, but as a case study in the criminal utility of overlooked systems. Several USPS protocols were rewritten as a result. Daily cash and inventory sync audits were implemented for all branches. Stamp refund caps were lowered, with stricter verification. Anonymous tip platforms were launched, giving employees a way to flag suspicious activity without fear of retaliation. And yet, the deeper takeaway is harder to quantify. For years, a group of people turned tiny rectangles of adhesive paper into a currency of survival, not for mansions, not for fame, but for a version of economic support they felt would never arrive otherwise. The USPS continues to sell stamps, billions of them each year. Most end up in drawers, junk mail, or the occasional wedding invitation. But in the dusty corners of small towns, where post offices still smell of musty carpet and old ink, there lingers a question. How many other Woolridges are still out there? And how many ledgers haven't been looked at in a very long time? Story 3. The man who filed 6,000 lawsuits and vanished. In the age of digital everything, few people ever step into a county courthouse unless they absolutely have to. But from 1996 to 2012, if you worked in any state court system east of the Mississippi, chances are you saw one name over and over again: Gideon Alcott. He wasn't a lawyer, not a paralegal, not a clerk or an academic. And yet he filed over 6,000 lawsuits. From small claims courts in rural Georgia to federal dockets in Michigan, Alcott's name appeared again and again, meticulously handwritten in blue ink or typed on decade-old word processors. Most of his suits were strange. Some bordered on surreal. A few seemed brilliant. Many were dismissed. But the volume, persistence, and method were unlike anything the legal system had seen. Then in 2012, Gideon Alcott vanished. No forwarding address, no family, no death certificate, just a final envelope mailed to a sleepy court in Alamaki County, Iowa. It contained 7 lawsuits, all targeting the U.S. Postal Service, and a single sheet of paper that read, "The law is not a tool, it's a key. You just need enough locks." That was the last anyone heard from him. The first filing. Gideon Alcott's first known court filing was in October 1996 in Cobb County, Georgia. It was a small claims case against a regional utility company over a disputed meter reading. The complaint was concise, polite, and backed by supporting documentation. He won the case. Over the next 18 months, Alcott filed 12 more suits, all small-scale, all pro se, without legal representation, and all involving service providers, cable companies, bank fees, apartment rental issues. He almost always won or reached settlement. But by 1999, the pattern began to shift. Alcott's filings grew more abstract, targeting vague concepts like billing methodology opacity or intentional obfuscation of rate schedules. He began referencing obscure precedent, legal doctrines that hadn't been invoked in decades, and often cited ancient English common law. Court clerks began to notice him. Judges grew annoyed. Still, the filings continued. The numbers grow. By 2005, Alcott had filed over 2,000 lawsuits. Nearly all were legitimate in form. He used the correct documents, paid the appropriate fees, and followed procedural rules to the letter. It was the substance of the filings that drew concern. Some cases involved fictional entities, like the Board of Industrial Arbitrators of Moonlight County, a non-existent agency that Alcott alleged had wronged him. Others were more symbolic, like his 2007 case against the Department of Unlisted Numbers, which appeared to be a metaphor for algorithmic discrimination in phone listings. He never threatened, never used violent language, but his presence began to clog the system. Courts tried to restrict him. Several judges issued vexatious litigant orders, barring him from filing without prior approval. But Alcott found workarounds, changing jurisdictions, rewording his identity slightly, e.g., Gideon A. Cott, G. Alcott, or partnering with individuals who would file under their names using his prepared briefs. His filings showed up in state, federal, and even bankruptcy courts, despite him never declaring bankruptcy. And with every case, he attached lengthy appendices. Some were collections of legal citations. Others were handwritten notes about legal philosophy, the nature of bureaucracy, or scrawled diagrams that resembled flowcharts for imaginary court systems. Was he insane or just brilliant? Legal scholars eventually took notice. In 2010, a Yale law student published a paper titled Alcott's Archive: Legal Strategy or Semantic Protest. The paper argued that Alcott wasn't mentally ill, but rather engaging in a form of bureaucratic performance art, weaponizing the legal system's rules against itself. It became a cult theory that Alcott was trying to map the weak spots in modern law through sheer volume. Others speculated he was attempting to break automated filing systems, confuse institutional databases, or trigger some sort of pattern detection threshold in government surveillance programs. One theory suggested that Alcott believed if he filed enough cases, one would open a legal backdoor, a procedural flaw that could allow him to gain access to something. No one was quite sure what. Whatever his motivation, he showed an encyclopedic understanding of court structure. He knew which clerks required notarized affidavits, which judges were least likely to flag certain terminology, which counties accepted filings via fax longer than 5 pages. In one brief he wrote, "Law is not the pursuit of justice, it's the choreography of words in an acceptable pattern." The disappearance. In early 2012, Alcott filed a series of cases in 3 Midwestern states, all involving allegations of postal routing manipulation. The suits claimed that zip code assignments were being used to create digital districts that denied residents access to certain services. He included spreadsheets, graphs, and hand-drawn maps. He referenced decades-old USPS internal documents that were difficult to obtain. His filings were dense, technical, and to some legal observers eerily well-informed. Then silence. No new cases. His P.O. box in Albany, New York, was closed for non-payment. His prepaid cell number disconnected. The apartment he rented under a pseudonym in Dayton, Ohio, was vacated without notice. A neighbor claimed he just packed a single suitcase and left. The only remaining clue was the envelope sent to Alamaki County, Iowa, postmarked April 14, 2012. It contained 7 lawsuits, all targeting the USPS, 3 blank checks for court fees, 1 note that read simply, "The key turns when no one is looking." His social security number was real, but it hadn't been used since. No missing person report was filed. No family came forward. As of 2025, he remains officially unaccounted for. After Gideon Alcott's disappearance in 2012, legal clerks from over a dozen states continued to receive correspondence in his name for nearly 2 years, documents backdated, envelopes postmarked from rotating cities, all carefully crafted to appear legitimate. But each time investigators tried to follow up by phone, by certified letter, by physical visit, there was no response and no sign of the sender. It was as if Gideon had become a procedural ghost, a presence that lingered in systems, not in person. The patterns that did fade. Despite his disappearance, the effects of Gideon's filings continued to ripple through the courts. Some of his cases remained active for years, not because they were particularly complex or viable, but because they were confusing. One case in Peoria, Illinois, demanded judicial review of a fiscal calendar realignment he claimed impacted small-time investors during leap years. Another, filed in Roanoke, Virginia, attempted to hold a now-defunct telecommunications company liable for non-declaration of service intent on dormant landlines. And yet another in Erie, Pennsylvania, was a class-action suit alleging algorithmic discrimination by regional mail sorters based on unregistered zip +4 codes. The legal community, once amused by Alcott's filings, had grown tired and wary. Some courts, facing a backlog from his caseload, began developing internal tags for filings that resembled Alcott-style content. Others quietly began to cross-check case language for stylistic markers, phrasing quirks, citation formatting, or repetitive analogies involving locks and keys. In 2015, a small private research group based in Ohio released a white paper titled "Semantic Redundancy in Pro-Se Litigation: The Alcott Effect." They claimed that Gideon had developed a linguistic fingerprint, a syntax structure so unique it could be identified through simple NLP models. They analyzed 800 of his known filings and found that 94% shared the same opening sentence pattern. This claim arises not from harm of action, but from deficiency of definition. That phrase would become a hallmark of his writing, used not as a legal argument, but as a philosophical statement. Gideon didn't sue because something happened to him. He sued because something wasn't clearly defined, and that, he argued, was enough. Who was Gideon Alcott really? Attempts to uncover Gideon's true identity hit wall after wall. His social security number, verified and valid, was issued in New Jersey in 1971, but no high school records, tax history, or medical files could be found. No driver's license in any state, no relatives, no social media presence, no memberships, subscriptions, or online footprint. A handful of rental applications and P.O. box records pointed to small towns and transitional housing. He paid everything in money orders or cashier's checks, never in personal checks or cards. In 2017, a Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) request yielded a strange result. Gideon had submitted 2 FOIA requests himself in 2008 and 2010, one to the U.S. Census Bureau and one to the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. The request to the Census Bureau was cryptic. Please provide raw format data fields for unlisted persons who exist legally, but not demographically. The second FOIA asked for metadata structure and error protocols for federal e-filing systems from 2001 to 2007. Both were denied. Still, the trail suggested one thing clearly: Gideon understood systems deeply and mechanically, not just legal doctrine but the bureaucratic framework supporting them. The lockbox discovery. In 2019, during a routine cleanout of an abandoned storage facility in Indiana, a manager stumbled on a rusted metal lockbox labeled only GA filing drafts. Inside were a portable word processor from the early 2000s, dozens of handwritten notebooks, rough drafts of lawsuits never submit, a flash drive containing thousands of legal templates, autofill forms, and performatted complaints. But the strangest item was a hand-drawn map, not geographic, but procedural. It appeared to chart the routing system of federal and municipal filings, using lines and symbols to trace how data flowed once submitted. The map wasn't labeled in full, but notations like SDNY overflow right arrow administrative clerk equals lag 90 days suggested it was built from real experiences and internal knowledge. A yellowed sticky note in the corner read, "Break isn't in the case, break is in the pass-through." This was a turning point for those still following the case. What if Alcott's goal had never been to win lawsuits, but to create a network of procedural bottlenecks? A map of the court system's blind spots, delays, and redundancies. Legal theorists who examined the materials proposed a daring idea. Gideon had been attempting to trigger a systemic cascade, a domino effect caused by accumulating inconsistencies, unclosed cases, and timing mismatches across jurisdictions. It wouldn't be illegal, just bureaucratically disruptive. Like hacking the court system using nothing but paper, time, and language. The federal response. By 2020, the U.S. Marshals Service quietly reclassified the Alcott case under a new category: disruptive civil actor, unknown intent. It was not criminal, per se, but recognized as an anomaly with the potential to undermine court operations. Internal memos suggested concern that other actors might replicate his model. The recommendations included randomizing procedural routing in certain courts, limiting public access to court e-filing flowcharts, implementing metadata screening for semantic signature patterns. There was even debate within the judiciary as to whether a minimum coherence standard should be introduced for pro-se filings, a dangerous idea with serious implications for access to justice. In effect, Gideon had forced the court system to reckon with itself. One judge put it this way in a legal blog: he didn't need a gavel, he needed a form, a pen, and infinite patience. The ongoing murmur. To this day, once or twice a year, a court somewhere in the U.S. receives a strange filing. It's usually hand-typed, oddly formatted, filled with elaborate definitions and legal analogies. Sometimes it involves non-existent agencies, Other times it focuses on highly specific procedural flaws like the time a case was thrown out because the clerk misread a time stamp. Most of these filings are dismissed, but every now and then one sticks. A judge reads it, a response is required, and the gears of the system turn just a little slower. No name ever appears on these filings that matches Gideon Alcott exactly. But the syntax, the structure, still unmistakable. By the time Gideon Alcott was legally declared missing, in 2018, a full 6 years after his last verified filing, his legacy had already metastasized into something more than the sum of his lawsuits. He wasn't just a name, he had become an idea. And like all persistent ideas, Gideon didn't disappear. He distributed. The final file. In 2021, a federal IT contractor working on archive restoration at the U.S. Court's Public Access to Court Electronic Records System PACER made a curious discovery. Buried in an outdated cache of corrupted metadata from the Western District of Arkansas was an unfiled draft lawsuit. It had no official case number, no timestamp, and it wasn't associated with any user account. The file's header read, "Request for clarification of jurisdictional identity." Attached was a 27-page brief written in Alcott's unmistakable prose, citing obscure doctrines from maritime law, early U.S. territorial codes, and citing the Montgomery County Courthouse fire of 1833 as precedent for the idea that legal jurisdiction can be momentarily ownerless. The brief didn't seek damages or redress. Instead, it requested that the court answer one question. When the record-keeping of a nation fails, who is allowed to speak in its place? The draft ended with a symbol, not a signature, a small key drawn in blue ink, surrounded by a circle of hash marks reminiscent of a postal cancellation stamp. Analysts determined that the file was uploaded via a brief vulnerability in PACER's legacy interface, likely inserted through an old court library terminal. It had no direct connection to an account, but the hash structure matched previous documents known to originate from Alcott. It was the first digital trace of him since 2012. No other attempts to locate him have succeeded. The philosophy of filing. As scholars, archivists, and even hobbyists pored over Gideon's cases, both the ones officially logged and the many stored in strange boxes and half-finished drafts, a picture emerged of a man who didn't see the law as a means to an end. He saw it as a landscape. Each form, each docket number, each jurisdiction was a different hill or valley. He wasn't trying to climb it. He was mapping it. His obsession with small claims courts in particular pointed to a unique theory, that the lowest rungs of the legal system were the most structurally vulnerable, overlooked, underfunded, and rarely cross-checked with larger systems. In one note found in his lockbox, he wrote, "The highest court is watched, the lowest court is trusted, but between them lies a wilderness of unchecked assumptions." Was it performance art, protest, or something else? Over the years, different communities have laid claim to Gideon Alcott. Legal scholars see him as a warning sign, proof that the system can be clogged, misdirected, and even quietly eroded by someone who knows its forms better than its function. Radical transparency activists hail him as a folk hero, using nothing but process to shine light on institutional shadows. Archivists debate whether he was a metahistorian, using filings to preserve obscure legal concepts otherwise lost to modern courts. Conspiracy theorists call him a deep state experiment in soft-pressure legal disruption. But one thing is clear. He understood bureaucracy not as a burden but as a language, a code, and he spoke it fluently. A former court clerk who processed over 400 of Alcott's filings put it best. He didn't think he could change the system. He just wanted to prove you could speak into it and be heard even if no one responded. Legacy in the shadows. There is no monument to Gideon Alcott, but traces of him live on in a 2023 legal tech startup that modeled its AI case review system on Alcott's recursive phrasing to train red flag detectors. Law schools that now dedicate portions of ethics courses to pro-se misuse, using his filings as a case study. Court systems that now automatically limit duplicate filing patterns thanks to Alcott threshold scripts. A private Reddit forum of over 10,000 users called Locksmith Law, where legal oddities are shared, often with stylized key and circle, tags a nod to his symbol. And then there are the letters. In 2024 alone, 12 separate court clerks in different U.S. states reported receiving sealed envelopes. Each one contained a simple piece of paper. I still exist, I am just out of bounds. No return address, no case number. Just the key symbol, and always written in the same unmistakable blue ink cursive. The unsolved question: if Gideon Alcott is still alive, he would be in his early 60s. It's possible he changed names. It's possible he lives completely off the grid. It's also possible he never existed the way we imagined him to. One theory, radical and fringe, is that Alcott was a collective pseudonym, a group of legal system insiders testing failure points and filing in coordinated waves. But handwriting analysis, phone logs, and in-person clerk reports all point to a single, eccentric man with immense patience and near-total anonymity. And if that's true, then Gideon Alcott managed to do something most of us never will. He left behind a legal echo, not by changing laws, not by defying them, but by engaging with them so relentlessly that he broke through the paper-thin boundary between existence and erasure. Somewhere out there, a new court case might arrive cryptic, unnecessary, strange. The judge will roll their eyes, the clerk will log it, the system will groan forward one more inch. And the question will hang in the air like the scent of musty paper and toner ink. What if this one is the key? Story 4, Operation Ivory Bookends, Customs and the Collector's Ring. The story didn't begin with a crime scene. No body, no missing person, no frantic 911 call. It began, quietly, with an oddly shaped package at the Port of Baltimore. On a rainy Wednesday morning in August 2015, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, agents at a routine inspection facility opened a shipment labeled as Antique Bookends Decorative, 1901, addressed to a private residence in Connecticut. The package, professionally wrapped and documented, contained two unusually heavy, smooth, ivory-colored objects artfully carved into the shapes of lions resting on scrolls. But something about the coloring and texture raised eyebrows. They didn't look like resin, and they were too heavy to be plastic. Initial suspicion was mild, possibly mislabeled ivory, a common issue with imported antique trinkets. But after testing by a Fish and Wildlife Service, FWS, biologist, the results stunned investigators. The bookends were carved from African elephant ivory and not antique. They were less than 20 years old. And this one intercepted package would unravel a multinational smuggling ring, an underground network of antique collectors, corrupt customs brokers, and rare book dealers, all tied together by a shared obsession: the fusion of literature and contraband. The customs anomaly. The receiver of the Baltimore package was Charles Amen, a 73-year-old retired librarian and collector living in rural Litchfield County, Connecticut. To those who knew him, Charles was eccentric but harmless. He maintained a personal library of over 10,000 volumes, cataloged with meticulous precision. He gave guest lectures at the local historical society and was particularly fascinated by early European bookbinding. But when agents arrived at his home to question him, they noticed something strange: his bookends. Dozens of them. Perched at the ends of nearly every shelf, the room seemed less like a library and more like a museum of sculpted weights. Lions, owls, minotaurs, busts of obscure philosophers, all carved, aged, and unusually consistent in material, a smooth, dense, ivory-like surface. CBP agents contacted the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for field assistance. A team was dispatched to conduct field testing using a portable FTIR spectrometer used to detect organic materials. The preliminary scans confirmed it. At least 14 pairs were made of illegal ivory. Charles, visibly shaken, admitted he had received most of them through trades and gifts, but claimed ignorance of their material composition. He said a name almost casually. "I think most of them came from a man named Warren." The Collector's Network. That single name unlocked a decade of shadows. Warren Desai, an Indian-born British national, had been flagged once by Interpol in 2008 for attempting to export protected bird specimens mislabeled as maritime antiques. The case was dropped due to insufficient evidence, and Warren's trail had since gone cold. But his name still lingered in classified intelligence briefings involving antique smuggling networks, particularly those that used cultural artifacts as a disguise for protected animal products. When the U.S. began probing customs data, a pattern emerged. Between 2010 and 2015, over 90 shipments of decorative bookends were imported into the U.S. from London, Hamburg, and Mumbai. Each shipment was valued at under $2,000 below the threshold that would trigger enhanced inspection protocols. Recipients were often private collectors, rare book dealers, or academics, people unlikely to face high scrutiny. And at least 40 of those shipments were connected to addresses tied to members of the Rare Binding Society, a niche association of antique book enthusiasts operating largely through private forums and discreet collector events. Books and Bones. What investigators slowly uncovered was a form of contraband trafficking built on intellectual insulation. Unlike drug mules or arms dealers, this ring didn't operate in the underworld. It existed inside libraries, universities, and auction halls. Their product: illegally sourced ivory, rhino horn, and tortoiseshell, all carved into objects associated with the literary world: bookends, inkwells, writing pens, and scroll weights. The logic was devious and simple. Disguise high-risk contraband as literary or academic items, things rarely subject to inspection. Use scholarly legitimacy to pass scrutiny. Customs officers were less likely to question shipments going to professors or rare book dealers. Undervalue the items to stay below inspection thresholds. Distribute in small batches to avoid creating obvious logistical patterns. The bookends investigators discovered were just the beginning. Operation Ivory Bookends. By late 2015, CBP, in coordination with Interpol and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, launched Operation Ivory Bookends, a quiet but expansive probe into the antique literary trade. Undercover agents posed as collectors in online forums. They attended collector fairs in Europe. They even infiltrated an invitation-only event in Geneva where members displayed exotic literary ephemera. The findings were sobering. One vendor offered an inkstand made from pangolin scale. Another showed off a 17th-century scroll weight that was confirmed to be carved narwhal tusk, illegal under CITES regulations. Most damning of all, some bookends were not just decorative, they contained hollow compartments for concealing smaller contraband items: rare feathers, uncut gems, powdered rhino horn. Warren Desai's name came up repeatedly. He was described not as a kingpin, but as a broker, a connector. He didn't sell the items himself, but facilitated introductions, vetted buyers, and arranged customs-friendly routing using fake academic sponsorship letters. The academic shield. Perhaps the most disturbing element of the case was how many respected academics and professionals were involved not necessarily knowingly, but complicit through willful ignorance. Customs agents traced several shipments to professors at top-tier universities, rare manuscript librarians, and prominent European bibliophiles. Most denied knowledge of the items' origins, claiming they were gifts or trades with collectors they'd met through scholarly channels. But emails told a different story. One thread between two rare booksellers included this line: "The lion pair is genuine, same texture as the Cairo shipment. Just don't use the word ivory this time, say it's cattle bone if asked." The language was coded, but unmistakable. And in each case, the physical object that transported the smuggled material was also itself a crime, a dual layer of concealment that made prosecution exceedingly difficult. Because what do you charge someone with when every item is real, functional, and criminal at the same time? The open drawer. In the Amun home, agents eventually found a hidden drawer inside an 18th century barrister's bookcase. Inside was a single piece of correspondence, an aged letter signed by Warren Desai. No return address, just a note. Beauty belongs in context. Ivory was born to sit beside wisdom. Let it rest where it is loved. That letter is now sealed in an FWS evidence archive. The quote became the unofficial slogan of the case file. Warren Desai has never been located. Interpol believes he may have assumed a new identity. Others suggest he died in 2016, though no death certificate exists. A handful of sightings, one in Portugal, one in Calcutta, remain unconfirmed. But the trade continues. Each year, customs agents still intercept small shipments, cleverly carved weights, novelty pens and bookends marked resin, but made of something older, something warmer to the touch. And somewhere out there, collectors still gather, still display, still protect what they see not as contraband, but as culture in exile. The deeper U.S. and European authorities dug into Operation Ivory Bookends, the clearer the central truth became. This wasn't a criminal syndicate in the traditional sense. There were no coded phone calls, no encrypted texts, no flashy bank transfers or burner accounts. What they had stumbled into was something far more elusive. A network of collectors, of scholars, of people who worship the physicality of objects, especially those tied to history, literature, and craftsmanship. And within that quiet obsession, a subset had evolved, one that saw illegality not as a deterrent, but as a necessary rebellion against modernity's attempt to sanitize the past. That subset called itself, rarely, in writing, the Society of Bindings. A collector's creed. A breakthrough came not through surveillance, but through an estate auction. In early 2016, the death of one Dr. Ingrid Mettner, a semi-retired medievalist from Zurich, led to the liquidation of her private library. Included in her papers was a hand-bound folio labeled only "The List." Inside were the names of 43 individuals, mostly in Europe and North America, alongside coded purchase logs, shipment data, and material abbreviations. AB equals oxbone. CI equals carved ivory. TS equals tortoise shell. MS equals mute swan quill. Each listing included a year, weight in grams, and initials. It appeared to be a trade ledger, tracking inbound and outbound items, many of which matched descriptions of bookends, inkwells, and scroll weights already seized in previous raids. Authorities cross-referenced the initials with customs data and discovered that 16 of the names had received shipments connected to Desai. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't the criminality, it was the philosophy. Tucked inside the folio was a sheet titled "The Creed of Materials," believed to be authored by Warren Desai himself. It read, in part, "We do not preserve objects. We preserve relationship, the hand to the pen, the page to the weight, the symbol to the medium. Material integrity must not be sacrificed for digital convenience or political fads. What was once common must not be erased simply because the world has grown forgetful. It was a manifesto, a justification, an argument that these materials, no matter how endangered or illegal, belonged with those who understood their history, not locked away or destroyed. For members of the Society of Bindings, the law wasn't a boundary. It was an obstacle to be navigated in service of preservation. The auction trap. Armed with the list, agents crafted a plan. Using a sting operation, they arranged for a fake estate auction in Brussels under the guise of liquidating the collection of a fictional antiquarian. The bait: a catalog of high-value literary relics including an ink blotter used by W.B. Yeats and an authentic First Empire ivory bookweight. Invitations were sent through known collector channels, coded forums, and private mailing lists. Several members from the list responded. One even flew from Toronto under an assumed name. But the key target wasn't a buyer, it was a broker. Posing as a courier named M. Ravello, the man arrived at the auction site with a sealed package intended for one of the buyers. He claimed he had no knowledge of the contents, he was just delivering. But under questioning, inconsistencies piled up. When customs agents opened the package, they found 2 tortoiseshell scroll weights, wrapped in linen pages torn from a 19th century Sanskrit translation of the Vedas. The address on the parcel: a known safe drop used by Warren Desai in 2011. The courier was arrested and, under pressure, revealed that he had been paid in antiquarian books, not money. Some had annotations, marginalia in fading ink, initials matching Warren's known handwriting. Anonymity as armor. Despite growing intelligence, the Society of Bindings proved exceptionally difficult to infiltrate. Its members communicated rarely, and when they did, it was through a patchwork of scholarly language and coded historical references. Conversations might include looking for a pair in the Provençal style, preferably pre-convention, seeking a resting weight with pre-industrial gloss and full provenance, avoiding resin nonsense, needs warmth under the wrist. These phrases signaled material expectations to those in the know, specifically referencing ivory, bone, or shell, rather than synthetic substitutes. The irony was that many of the items were not even necessary to the collectors. They didn't use the scroll weights or blotters. They displayed them, paired them with period-authentic manuscripts, argued that real preservation required real materials, no matter how controversial. The black market economy they fueled wasn't driven by profit. It was driven by aesthetic conviction. And in many ways, that made it more dangerous. The legal dilemma. By 2017, the US, UK, and Switzerland had issued over 70 combined subpoenas and asset seizures tied to Operation Ivory Bookends. But convictions few. Why? Most items were authentic antiques, muddying the legal waters of material age and provenance. Collectors had plausible deniability: gifts, trades, or estate purchases with no paper trail. Shipments were small, often below prosecutable thresholds individually. Cultural value complicated prosecution. Courts were hesitant to criminalize objects tied to literary or academic heritage. In short, the smugglers were protected by the very systems they claimed to revere. One U.S. prosecutor described it as trying to indict a library. A final shipment. In early 2018, long after Desai had vanished from the public eye, one last shipment bearing his alleged mark surfaced in Wichita, Kansas. The recipient was a retired Latin teacher who had ordered a pair of Pythagorean bookends from a catalog she said she received in the mail. When opened, the bookends tested positive for fresh ivory, and the internal packing paper was written in Old German, not a language the recipient understood. Pressed for details, she said. It looked like something from a museum. I didn't think anything of it. Inside one of the bookends, sealed behind a removable panel, was a slip of paper. History is tactile. The moment you forget how something felt, you lose the story. It was signed only with a single character, W. Whether it was Desai or a follower, no one could say. But the sentiment echoed across every object seized, every lecture intercepted, every digital forum thread buried beneath layers of academic code. The crime wasn't in the object. The crime was in letting it be forgotten. The final stages of Operation Ivory Bookends did not end with a dramatic takedown or even a central trial. Instead, it slowly faded into a legal purgatory, cases pending, assets seized, and collectors quietly backing away from their more exotic tastes. The courts, burdened by ambiguity and jurisdictional gray areas, chose discretion over spectacle. But the story didn't end there. It lingered, as all quiet crimes do, just beneath the surface of polite society, academic discourse, and dust-covered reading rooms. A quiet archive. In 2019, following the winding down of the International Task Force, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service opened a restricted archive in a nondescript building in Maryland. Known internally as the Heritage Contraband Vault, it now houses over 180 illegal literary artifacts seized during Operation Ivory Bookends. Among them, bookends carved from elephant ivory, some inlaid with gold leaf, each one shaped like a historic author: Pliny, Seneca, Marlowe. A scroll weight shaped like a curled pangolin, its tail etched with Latin phrases from Cicero's De Legibus. Quill pens made of mute swan feathers, tipped with whalebone nibs. A mahogany writing desk with internal compartments lined in tortoiseshell veneer, containing maps of shipping routes used by Desai's network. But perhaps the most haunting item is a ledger, not one from customs or courts, but a handwritten catalog belonging to Warren Desai himself. It was found tucked inside a hollowed-out book, a copy of The Library at Night by Alberto Mangel, discovered during a search of a Swiss customs broker's office. The ledger contains a full inventory of known participants, coded by animal material and object type, descriptions of each item's contextual ideal, the manuscript or author it was designed to accompany, and finally, a short final entry. I do not sell history, I shelter it. If the world cannot hold its past with bare hands, then it must borrow mine. The ledger has never been published. Officials fear that doing so would glamorize or revive the network. But in private circles, its legend has only grown. Collectors in exile. After the operation, many members of the Society of Bindings vanished from public view. Some auctioned off their collections quietly, anonymously. Others shifted to legal artifacts, embracing synthetics and forgeries in symbolic protest. A handful faced quiet charges: smuggling, customs fraud, violations of the Endangered Species Act, but most settled with fines or forfeiture. No central figure was ever prosecuted. Warren Desai remains unlocated. Interpol considers the case open but dormant. There are whispers, of course. A man matching his description sighted in Marrakesh, browsing antique scrolls at a market. A private library in Belgium, rumored to be his final archive. A letter, unverified, mailed to a rare bookshop in London. It contained no return address but read. The items are safe. They are with those who still read by candlelight. A law too late. The case raised difficult questions for legislators. In 2020, Congress considered a bill that would standardize prosecution of antique contraband by removing the cultural exemption clause, a legal gray area allowing certain banned materials if deemed historically relevant. The bill failed. Lobbyists for museums, private collectors, and academic institutions argued that such a law would criminalize entire sections of legitimate history, that it would paint too broad a brush. One senator in closed committee was quoted as saying, "We're trying to separate crime from memory. It's not always possible." And so the law stayed porous. And the world moved on. The tactile memory war. At the heart of Operation Ivory Bookends was a philosophical question that never made the news. Is physical history sacred even when it comes from cruelty? The collectors believed it was, that removing ivory from cultural circulation was an erasure, that digitizing literature and plasticizing instruments turned legacy into simulacra. They called themselves stewards, preservationists, the last line between genuine heritage and sterile imitation. Law enforcement, meanwhile, saw something more dangerous, a world where intellectual legitimacy was used to smuggle forbidden goods, where the robes of academia could cloak black market transactions. As one agent put it, they didn't think they were criminals, they thought they were curators. And that distinction made them harder to stop than any cartel. The end of the shelves. Charles Amen, the retired librarian whose Connecticut home helped spark the investigation, died in 2021. He left no will, no known family. But among his things was one final note, handwritten and placed between two volumes of Marcus Aurelius. "I never thought of it as ivory. I thought of it as weight, something to keep the past from slipping off the edge." He was never charged with a crime. The items seized from his home remain locked in federal storage, each tagged with its own evidence number, each waiting for a verdict that may never come. And in libraries, in private studies, in shadowed drawing rooms around the world, a few shelves still hold the quiet curve of something warm, polished, and ancient. No one speaks of it now, but they feel it beneath their fingertips as they reach for the next book. Story 5. The small-town dentist with a skeleton in every closet. On the surface, the town of Carver's Hollow, Indiana, was no different from hundreds of other Midwestern communities slowly losing their edges to time. Population 4,219. One high school, one pizza place, two churches, and a solitary brick building on Oak Street where generations of locals got their teeth cleaned. Inside that squat three-room office was Dr. Lenwood Cray, DDS, known simply as Doc Len. He had practiced dentistry in Carver's Hollow for over 45 years. Children grew up under his care, came back as adults, and brought their own children with them. He was affable, calming, and famous for humming classical piano pieces while working, especially during extractions. But in 2020, a renovation crew hired to update the office's aging plumbing system uncovered something unusual beneath the old tile floor. Bones. Dozens of them human. Some intact, some fragmented, all deliberately wrapped in gauze and stored in waterproof containers, hidden inside an old root cellar that had been sealed for decades. The call to police came quickly, and Carver's Hollow would soon become the epicenter of one of the strangest forensic investigations in modern small-town history. An office of oddities. Dr. Lenwood Cray was 78 years old when the discovery was made, still working 3 days a week, still sharp, still beloved. He cooperated with investigators fully. He claimed to have no knowledge of the bones, said he never knew there was a sub-basement beneath his office, that the building had belonged to another dentist before him, Dr. Lyle Bennings, who died in 1971. Cray had purchased the practice, as is, the following year, and claimed he had never questioned the structure of the place. But some details didn't sit right. For one, Cray owned the building outright and had overseen every repair and renovation himself over the decades. He had personally installed new floorboards in the early 1980s. Second, the containers were clearly of modern design Tupperware models manufactured in the 1990s, complete with serial numbers that linked to shipments sold in Indiana. Worse still, every skull fragment and long bone had been scored and sectioned cut with precise tools. Dental tools. The bone count rises. The excavation uncovered 32 distinct sets of remains, all incomplete, stored over what appeared to be a 20-25-year span. Forensic anthropologists confirmed. Most of the bones belonged to adult males, aged 40-65. None of the skulls bore gunshot trauma or blunt force injury. Many showed signs of surgical alteration, with cuts and grooves made post-mortem. Several had dental hardware crowns, fillings, implants consistent with modern dental procedures. A forensic odontologist matched 5 of the dental records to missing persons from surrounding counties' men last seen between 1996 and 2011. 3 were veterans. 1 was a known transient. 1 was a drifter with no known family. None had ever been flagged as victims of foul play. The town refuses to believe. As news spread, Carver's Hollow reacted with disbelief. This was Doc Len, the man who donated free dental care to school kids every fall, the man who ran the town's tiny holiday parade float committee, the man who helped a widow fix her broken gate every spring. In interviews, townspeople swore by him. He pulled my wisdom teeth in high school, never even bruised me. He fixed my dad's dentures for free after the VA botched them. He babysat my dogs when I had to fly out for my sister's wedding. But the evidence was hard to ignore. At the very least, someone had stored mutilated human remains under the office that Cray had worked in, owned, and updated for nearly 5 decades. The FBI was brought in. The Indiana State Police set up a task force. Cray was not charged immediately. He was placed under surveillance while evidence was processed. Then quietly, a tip came in. The van in the woods. A retired postal worker named Joey Dalt came forward, said he remembered something from the late 90s, a white utility van parked behind the dental office for weeks during the winter. No logo, no license plate visible from the road. When asked why he hadn't mentioned it earlier, Joey said, "It didn't seem important until now, but I remember it because it made a weird whistling sound when it idled." Investigators pulled zoning permits and repair records. No utility work had been authorized that year. But aerial photos from a local newspaper archive, taken for a Blizzard story in January 1999, showed the van, parked exactly where Joey described. What was more, a second van, this one belonging to the clinic, was registered to a shell company called Midwood Dental Solutions LLC, a business not listed in any state database and with a P.O. box in Terre Haute. Ownership records tied the company back to name. Carson Bramble, a former dental technician, suspended license, last known address, Evansville, Indiana, disappeared in 2002. That's when the theory changed. Maybe Cray hadn't acted alone. Maybe this wasn't a murder investigation. Maybe it was something else entirely. The name Carson Bramble had meant nothing to the residents of Carver's Hollow, but to the forensic analysts, his resurfacing was a crack in the porcelain veneer of Doc Len's carefully maintained life. Bramble's dental technician license had been suspended in 1998 for improper storage of biohazard materials and unlicensed use of anesthetics. He had worked briefly in Evansville and then vanished from professional records. His phone was disconnected. His apartment was cleared out overnight. His file remained marked as no known current address. Now, 22 years later, his name was tied to a shell company that owned a vehicle registered to Cray's dental clinic and indirectly to 32 partial skeletons hidden beneath its floors. The FBI reclassified the investigation. What had begun as a mysterious case of bones became something far more complex, a potential black market operation involving human remains, rogue dental practices, and decades of concealment behind a dentist's gentle smile. And with Bramble still missing, the question remained: was he a rogue technician? Or was he the architect of something deeper? The tools don't lie. When investigators executed a second search warrant on Cray's office, this time focusing on instrumentation they seized: 8 sets of bone saws not listed in standard dental inventory, a specialized autoclave capable of sterilizing organic material at medical-grade temperatures, a vacuum-sealed packaging system containing trace amounts of calcium phosphate common in bone dust, 5 molars each with traces of surgical resin and signs of manual extraction post-mortem. More alarming was a discovery in the basement utility closet. Behind a false wall panel, agents found dental molds, dozens of them, individually labeled with handwritten codes but no patient names. Each one had bite patterns, crowns, restorations. Forensic odontology confirmed that at least 7 molds matched missing persons, identified through dental records in neighboring counties. This suggested the molds were made not during treatment, but after death. And the implications grew darker. Why would anyone preserve post-mortem dental molds? The answer came in the form of an old cardboard box, discovered in Doc Lynn's attic, marked simply, "Study CASTS Bramble." Inside were folders: Mandible Series A Male 50s, Maxillary Defects Rural Subjects, Pterygoid Muscle Decay Unpreserved. It read like a research archive. But there was no study, no institutional affiliation, no IRB approvals, no academic correspondence. It was a ghost archive, a catalog of the dead, made by men with licenses long expired and ethics long discarded. The buyer's list. The most damning piece of evidence came, as it so often does, through paperwork someone forgot to shred. In a rusted file cabinet in the back of the clinic's locked storage room, agents found receipts. Not for treatments or prescriptions, but for shipments. Plain boxes, coded with only numbers, destined for addresses across the Midwest, some to private homes, others to P.O. boxes, and one to a now-defunct osteological supply shop in St. Louis. Most were sent during the late 1990s to early 2000s, aligning with Bramble's last active years. Each shipment was marked with a note: "Fragments study use." This alone was not conclusive. Bones are commonly used for anatomical study in medical institutions, but the shipments didn't go to universities or accredited labs. They went to individuals. Buyers. When agents traced one of the P.O. boxes, they discovered it belonged to a private collector who had, for years, quietly purchased dental anomalies and bone fragments for what he called forensic modeling. No license, no affiliation, just curiosity. He wasn't the only one. Over time, a pattern emerged. A small underground trade of human skeletal material, passed off as medical surplus, sold without oversight, and often harvested from unclaimed individuals, or worse, from people never reported missing at all. The trail always led back to Bramble's name. And to Cray's building. Doc Lynn's story cracks. When confronted with this new evidence, Cray's demeanor changed. He no longer hummed during questioning, no longer smiled through interviews. Instead, he offered a confession of sorts, but one carefully crafted to suggest that he was more a bystander than participant. He admitted to hearing Bramble in 1997 as an off-site technician to assist with dental prosthetics. Said Bramble offered high-quality work for low prices, and that he didn't ask questions because money was tight and Bramble kept to himself. Cray claimed Bramble had access to the building after hours, via a side entrance. Claimed he had no idea Bramble was storing bones beneath the floor. said he believed the molds were for educational purposes. When asked why he never alerted authorities after Bramble vanished in 2002, Cray shrugged. "I assumed he just moved on. Technicians bounce around. I never looked into it." But prosecutors saw the story differently. They saw a man who had signed off on utilities and renovations that concealed an underground space, installed a false wall panel and never questioned its use, ordered shipments of packing materials used in the transport of biological tissue, cashed checks from shell companies tied to the trade. Doc Len was no longer a kindly small-town dentist. He was a link in a clandestine trade in the remains of forgotten men. The legal maze. Despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the case presented prosecutors with a legal labyrinth. There were no eyewitnesses. The suspected accomplice, Bramble, remained missing, possibly dead. The buyers had purchased materials under legally ambiguous conditions, often labeled as for study use or anatomical specimens. And Cray himself had a spotless record, with decades of community trust and no history of abuse or malpractice. But eventually, the weight of the evidence tipped the scale. In 2022, Dr. Lenwood Cray was indicted on 18 counts of unlawful possession and distribution of human remains, 7 counts of obstructing justice, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud in medical documentation. He pled not guilty, and the case is currently pending trial. Cray remains under house arrest, no longer permitted to practice, his license revoked. The dental office has been condemned. Carver's Hollow is quiet. And beneath that quiet, residents whisper about the past, about the men who vanished, about the hum of classical piano, and the truth that was, for so long, buried just beneath their feet. When the town of Carver's Hollow gathered for its annual Memorial Day parade in 2023, the absence was impossible to ignore. The dentist's float, once adorned with toothbrush mascots and oversized molars, was missing. The storefront at 211 Oak Street was boarded shut. The lot where children once lined up for free Halloween candy from Doc Len was overgrown with weeds. No one talked about the bones anymore. But no one had forgotten the trial that never happened. In the spring of 2023, after nearly a year of legal preparation, Dr. Lenwood Cray's case was scheduled for trial in Indiana's Southern District Court. Local media began calling it the Hollow Bones case. National outlets requested comment. A Netflix documentary crew inquired about rights. The town resisted. But just 2 weeks before jury selection, the case collapsed. A procedural review revealed that key evidence had been mishandled during the second search of Cray's property. Specifically, a court order signed by a judge in another district had been misfiled, making the chain of custody on the discovered dental molds legally compromised. Without those molds, without direct links between the bones, Bramble's archives, and Cray's active role, the prosecution's foundation crumbled. Faced with the possibility of losing entirely, the U.S. Attorney's Office accepted a plea deal. Cray would admit guilt to a single Class D felony count, failure to report human remains. He would serve no jail time, but be permanently barred from practicing dentistry or working in any medical capacity. He would pay fines, surrender his professional licenses, and agree to remain in Carver's Hollow under monitored release. To many in the town, it felt like a betrayal. But to investigators, it was the only path left. Because without Bramble, the case was like a root canal without X-rays, painful, uncertain, and blind in places that mattered most. The technician revisited. Despite every effort, Carson Bramble was never found. Interpol searches yielded nothing. DNA from the clinic yielded no match. Family, none located. But in late 2023, A strange envelope was mailed to the Indiana State Police, addressed to the cold case unit. Inside, a single dental cast of an upper jaw, heavily worn, missing 3 molars. A photocopied note, "I never stopped learning." A return address from Paraguay handwritten and determined to be fake. The mold was authentic. Forensic analysis revealed it matched Bramble's patient record from the 1990s, when he was briefly registered as a dental tech assistant in Illinois. The jaw was real. The message was cryptic. Did he mail it himself? Was someone else continuing his work? No fingerprints, no postage trail. Just a reminder. The dead had teachers, and some of those teachers were still out there. Memory, management, and myth. Carver's Hollow struggled with the aftermath in a way only small towns can, slowly, unevenly, and just beneath the surface. The town council voted to tear down the building on Oak Street. It was demolished in a single day. No ceremony, no press. A gravel lot remains, grass already creeping back through the cracks. The high school yearbook removed Cray's honorary mention. His name was stricken from the library donor wall. But the older residents still remember. Some say it wasn't him. Others say he just got tired of burying what no one else would claim. Maybe he didn't kill them, one former patient whispered. But he didn't let them leave either. The victims, officially, remain unnamed. Only 5 of the 32 partial remains were positively identified. The rest sit in a cold room at the Indiana Department of Forensic Anthropology, tagged only by bone counts and estimated age ranges. No graves, no closure. Just evidence. The broader pattern. Cray's case prompted a statewide review of small private medical practices and unlicensed technicians operating in rural Indiana and Ohio during the late 90s and early 2000s. What emerged was a pattern. At least 14 unlicensed individuals were found to have performed unauthorized procedures in off-the-books clinics. Multiple cases of missing persons were reopened, particularly among transient or undocumented populations. In one case, a farm tool shed in southern Illinois was found to contain dental casts and bone fragments, dating back 20 years. These weren't murders in the traditional sense. They were part of a quiet harvesting economy built on the margins of medicine, where remains were used, sold, or studied in complete disregard of identity, consent, or law. Cray and Bramble were not unique. They were part of a decentralized culture of anatomical misuse, one enabled by lack of oversight, professional loneliness, and just enough plausible deniability to keep the spotlight away. The real horror wasn't in the cellar. It was in how long it took anyone to look. A final visit. Before his death in early 2024, quietly, at home, of natural causes, Cray was interviewed once more by a journalist working on an oral history of the case. When asked why he kept the bones, why he allowed it all to continue, he didn't deny it. He simply said, "Sometimes a body just wants to be useful, even after it's done living." His funeral was unattended. His estate was seized to cover legal fines. His legacy, in a town that once adored him, now lives only in hushed tones and cautionary tales. The site of his office is now a community garden. But some still say, late at night, if you stand where the floor used to be, you can hear the sound of a steel tool on enamel, quiet, rhythmic, and impossibly precise. Story 6. The Woman Who Stole Thursday. On May 12, 2011, in the town of Minturn, Oregon, a curious anomaly rippled through the local bureaucracy. A scheduled city zoning meeting set for Thursday, May 12, never happened. Not postponed, not rescheduled, not canceled. According to official records, the meeting was attended, documented, and voted upon. Only problem, no one remembered going. No minutes were logged, no audio recorded. The city clerk's attendance sheet was signed, but in the wrong pen with the wrong date, and in handwriting that, according to her own sworn statement, she didn't recognize as her own. By itself, it might have been chalked up to a filing mistake. But that week, a series of other small anomalies began to pile up. A local bakery's Thursday receipts were dated Friday, May 13. The town newspaper's Thursday edition was missing entirely, with Friday's issue printed a day early. Surveillance footage from City Hall showed a full day of blank screen time from midnight Wednesday to 11:59 p.m. Thursday. It was as if the entire day had gone missing. And at the center of it all was a woman no one remembered hearing, and no one could locate afterward. Darla Jean Lafferty, Municipal Records Assistant, employed for precisely 1 week. A woman who, by all accounts, had stolen a day from Mintern's collective memory. Introducing Darla Jean. Darla Jean Lafferty was first noted on the city payroll on May 5, 2011, with a temporary contract for archival management support. Her references were impeccable. Her background check was clean. But here where it gets strange. Her application paperwork was typed on a model of typewriter, no longer manufactured. Her social security number matched an individual who had died in 1977 in Texas. The address she listed, 204 Bingham Road, did not exist, not then and not now. Coworkers remembered her vaguely. She was quiet. She brought in deviled eggs. She wore gloves even indoors. But when asked to describe her face, most hesitated. It's hard to say. She had brown hair, or maybe gray. Sort of a librarian look. And yet she signed in every day 9 to 5. She filed municipal records. She answered phones. Until Thursday, May 12, when she didn't sign out. And no one remembered her leaving. The basement file. The real clue came weeks later, when a junior records clerk cleaning out the basement of City Hall found a filing drawer labeled El Temporal Requests. Inside, among outdated permit forms and long-forgotten building codes, were a sealed envelope labeled Do Not Open Until May 12. Inside, an outdated map of the city with areas circled in red, all of which coincided with known zoning disputes. A stamped form titled Petition for Intercalendar Adjustment, referencing statutes that did not exist under Oregon law. A handwritten note on onion skin paper. One missing day will stop a decade of wrong ones. You'll thank me later, D. Investigators from the State Archives office were called in. Theories ranged from performance art to mental health crisis to bureaucratic hoax. But no conclusion could explain what happened next. The missing permit trail. When city planners cross-checked building permits issued during the spring of 2011, they noticed a discrepancy. One permit issued to a property developer building senior housing had been stamped, approved, and filed with signatures dated May 12. But no one remembered reviewing it. No official claimed to have signed it. And the zoning laws it cited had not yet been passed. In fact, they would not be formally enacted until August 2011. The permit granted approval before the regulations existed. It had come into being on a day that vanished, and Darla Jean Lafferty had been the only person with access to those files. The housing complex now stands on land that was once protected wetland. It was built legally, no violations. But without Thursday, May 12, 2011, the permit should not have existed. A broader pattern emerges. Curious about the case, a local journalist named Caleb Schuster began digging into similar anomalies. Using public records databases, he found 5 other towns small, administrative, mostly rural where a single-day scheduling error led to unexpected approvals. A temporary records clerk was briefly employed, and then disappeared. A form referencing intercalendar adjustments had been filed. In each case, the temporary employee had a different name: Jeanette D. Larkin, DJ Langley, L. Darla Jensen, but always the same initials, always a similar role. In one town, she worked as a mail sorter. In another, as a typist. In one 1987 case, she was listed as temporal compliance manager, a role that doesn't exist in any known civic department. Shuster published an exposé titled, "The Woman Who Stole Thursday, Bureaucracy's Phantom." It received little national attention. But among archivists, city clerks, and certain conspiracy theorists, Darla Jean became a folk figure. A time thief, a zoning witch, a lone archivist correcting the calendar, one day at a time. By the time journalist Caleb Shuster dug into his fourth municipal anomaly involving Darla Jean Lafferty, or whatever variant she used, it was no longer just a story about a missing day. It had become something far more elusive, a pattern of unauthorized chronological manipulation, quietly embedded in the backrooms of bureaucracy. Each town shared the same traits: low-profile civic activity, a recent or upcoming zoning battle or land use change, a single day where records blurred, skipped, or outright disappeared. And always, the presence of a woman whose paper trail was as brittle and vague as a sun-faded fax sheet. Shuster wasn't the only one watching. The Office of Document Integrity, buried within the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, is a little-known sub-office, Document Integrity Monitoring Services, DIMS. Not a law enforcement agency, not publicly searchable. It exists purely to investigate disruptions in official documentation, timelines, things like pages with dates that predate the typewriter used to produce them, unexplainable gaps in microfilm sequences, city council decisions referencing laws not yet passed. In July 2011, after the Minturn case made light waves among government archivists, DIMS quietly dispatched a field information agent to the town. His notes, obtained years later via a whistleblower leak, are fascinating. Subject known as Darla Jean Lafferty appears to exhibit working knowledge of municipal documentation structures and legislative timing frameworks. Her actions suggest premeditated exploitation of procedural gaps, specifically in the window between draft and formal enactment. Town appears unaware it has been adjusted, clerical staff disoriented but not alarmed. No known digital footprint of subject. Suspected use of legacy filing protocols, carbon, onion skin, triplicate. Possible use of expired employee badge templates. The agent's final report was titled, "Chrono Administrative Sabotage, Mild Risk Tier." No further action was taken. DIMS closed the file. But Caleb Shuster did not. A visit to Dry Creek. One of the anomalies Shuster had traced led him to Dry Creek, Utah, population 2001. The town had experienced a similar missing day back in 1993, long before Minturn's May 12 disappearance. Local legend told of the day the phones didn't ring. Residents recalled a Thursday when nothing happened. The post office didn't open. The library marked the wrong date. A teenager swore the sun set at 6:17 p.m. when it should have been after 8:00. And someone named Miss Lafferty had worked for 1 week at the town records hall. When Shuster requested her employment file, it had only one document, a personnel intake form, dated February 30, 1993. A non-existent date, typed on paper from the 1960s, stamped with ink that contained compounds no longer used after 1982. At the bottom of the page was a strange rubber stamp, shaped like a spiral. Underneath, recalibrated. Schuster began to wonder, was this woman changing records or changing reality? The calendar loophole. In August 2011, a cryptographer-turned-historian named Marjorie Lynn reached out to Schuster with her own theory. She believed that Darla Jean was exploiting what she called the calendar loophole, a little-known side effect of administrative lag. Every year, hundreds of local and state agencies delay formal implementation of zoning changes, tax adjustments, and planning decisions. Between draft approval and final enactment, there exists a narrow liminal period, often exactly 1 day long, when reality and record-keeping are briefly out of sync. In this window, a future decision may be referenced as if it's already law. An old statute may still be enforced despite having been overturned. Lynn proposed that Darla Jean operated within this temporal gray zone, slipping into the bureaucratic cracks, adjusting outcomes by removing or rewriting the day in which the future would have been contested. She's not erasing time, Lynn said. She's editing inevitability. Lynn called it Thursday law, a theoretical framework where small changes to paperwork on the right forgotten day could shift land use, legal interpretations, or entire town policies without anyone knowing. And Thursday, it turns out, was the most common day for such policy windows to be open, because Friday was when the paperwork usually got filed, and Monday was always too late. The recorder's office disappearance. In December 2011, Schuster returned to Minturn to follow up with Cynthia Reeves, the city clerk who'd initially signed Darla Jean's employment paperwork. Reeves had retired, lived quietly in a nearby town. When he arrived at her house, she offered tea and cookies, then confessed something odd. "I found a letter in my desk the week after she left. It was sealed, just said, 'Cynthia, it'll all look normal soon. Just don't change the locks until Friday, D.' Reeves never mentioned it before because she had no memory of anyone delivering it. But what disturbed her more was what she discovered 2 months later. Her own signature from an old land use hearing in 2007, appearing on a document she had never seen before. That document later helped secure a permit for the very same senior housing project built after May 12. She believes she didn't sign it, at least not in 2007. But the ink was real, the records matched, and her handwriting was, somehow, perfectly hers. Reeves looked at Schuster and said, "She didn't just steal Thursday, Caleb, she borrowed it, then gave it back in pieces, wherever she needed to." The spiral appears again. In February 2012, a public records clerk in Spokane, Washington, found a mysterious envelope tucked inside an old registrar's journal. Inside, a single carbon copy slip. The spiral stamp. A typed message, "Don't chase Thursdays you can't get back." The slip was signed, D.J. Lafferty. Position, Temporal Clerk Emeritus. To this day, there is no known agency that employs anyone by that title. But within archivist circles and deep bureaucracy forums, Darla Jean is still talked about in hushed tones. Some believe she's a time traveler. Some think she's a metaphor. Others suspect she's part of a quiet, decades-long internal correction agency, fixing bad policy outcomes by tampering with days no one notices until they're already gone. On a cold morning in March 2012, Caleb Schuster received a package without a return address. Inside was a single item, a Thursday edition of the Minturn Gazette dated May 12, 2011. It had never been printed. Until now. It bore all the markers of a legitimate publication. Editorial by a real columnist who swore he never wrote it. Obituaries for individuals who, by all other accounts, died on Friday, May 13. A community event listing that never happened. The paper was typeset using a font the Gazette hadn't used since 1998. The print smelled of ozone and toner. The layout matched the format used 2 years earlier, before a redesign. And in the classified section, buried beneath fake ads and sale notices, was a small personal notice. Looking for Thursdays misplaced in 2011. If found, do not photocopy. Recalibration in progress. Day. Schuster held it in his hands for a long time. Then, without telling anyone, he burned it. Because by now he believed. The purpose behind the pattern. Was Darla Jean Lafferty a saboteur? A thief of time? A lone clerk with access to a mechanism no one else understood? Or was she something stranger? A corrective force? If you looked closely at the towns she appeared in, and the policies altered under her brief tenure, a motif emerged. In Minturn, a wetland zoning law was bypassed to allow elder housing, which the town desperately needed. In Dry Creek, a toxic industrial contract mysteriously never finalized documents disappeared, replaced with stricter environmental clauses. In Nevada, a housing development was halted because an error changed the land from commercial to historic zone, protecting a tribal site. Each anomaly benefited the vulnerable. Each stolen day prevented an unjust future from locking in. What if she wasn't disrupting time? What if she was editing harm? A letter from the edge. A year later, a librarian in Greeley, Colorado, received a letter from a woman claiming to be a Thursday recovery clerk. Typed on onion skin paper, it read, "We operate where procedural inertia harms real people. We use your own systems. We do not ask permission. We do not repeat. We do not exist. If you're reading this, your Thursday is back where it belongs. You're welcome." No signature. Just a spiral stamp. The librarian uploaded the letter to a small forum frequented by record keepers, urban archivists, and administrative historians. It sparked another round of whispered speculation. And then silence. No new confirmed Darla Jean sightings emerged. The Thursday thefts appeared to stop. But maybe, just maybe, there were fewer unjust rezonings. Fewer mysterious approvals. Fewer forms that should never have passed. Or perhaps she just became more careful. What does it mean to steal a day? There are no laws against stealing a weekday. No criminal code for removing time from collective awareness via filing tricks, outdated stamps, or legislative phantom clauses. Yet in the bureaucratic realm, days are everything. One day too early, a policy fails. One day too late, it becomes irreversible. Somewhere between those thresholds lives a gray space, a liminal fold in the structure of time not measured by clocks, but by paperwork. And if someone had the knowledge and patience to learn how that space functioned, they could shape the future without ever touching a machine. Just a file, a date, a single line of type. A Thursday, nudged out of the week so something better could take its place. Where is she now? There are rumors. In 2015, a zoning officer in Duluth received a misdated permit stamped with the spiral. In 2017, a teacher in New Mexico found an old school calendar with 2 Wednesdays and no Thursday with a sticky note that said, "Corrected." In 2020, a city planner in Vermont claimed his laptop powered on with a draft policy labeled Version D Gene. Use this one. Nothing confirmed. No one has seen her face since Minturn. But on a Reddit forum for municipal workers, one user named Chrono Clerk once wrote, "Thursdays aren't fixed, they're negotiated. Be glad someone's still doing the work." The comment was deleted 20 minutes later. Legacy in the files. The story of Darla Jean Lafferty has never made major headlines. It doesn't sell books or spark outrage. But among the hidden army of record keepers, municipal clerks, file room supervisors, and dusty archivists across America, she is legend. A whispered reminder that the smallest changes matter. Paperwork has power. The future is shaped not by bold proclamations, but by quiet, deliberate acts of redirection, often filed away in drawers no one bothers to open. So if one day your calendar feels off, if you notice a permit approved when it shouldn't have been, or a vote that changed when no one was looking, if your Thursday feels like it never quite arrived, don't panic. You didn't forget it. It was borrowed by someone who knew better. And maybe, just maybe, she gave it to someone who needed it more.